So that's the general idea. That's the introduction. Like I said, I'm going to share this talk in English, and we'll go through as much as we can. It's a different style than the other talks. It's the earlier years, so it reads more, flows more, not as many deep questions and answers, but it's very interesting nonetheless. But another thing I wanted to talk about is that what we're going to focus on is the difference between the name change of Abraham and the name change of Jacob to Israel. Abraham also had a name change. God changed his name from Avram to Avraham. He added a hey. And the Talmud goes to the point, goes to the extent, and the Talmud says that no longer are we allowed. The verse says, "Lo yikare et shimcha Avraham." I'm sorry, I may have misquoted the verse. In any case, the verse says, the Talmud says, anybody who calls Avraham, if you refer to him as Avram, you're violating a commandment, because the Torah says, no, your name won't be Avram, will be Avraham. So once the name is changed, we don't go back. However, when it comes to Isaac and Israel, when it comes to Jacob and Israel, the new name Israel, the name change is an addition, but it doesn't detract from the old name. And Jacob has two names. He's named Jacob and Israel, unlike Avram, who's transformed from Avram to Avraham. Now, the verse is very similar. There is a verse later, God confirms the name change, and God says, no longer will your name be called Israel, it will be called Jacob. No longer will your name be called Jacob, it will be called Israel. So it's almost the same words. And yet here we say, oh no, when we say no longer, we no longer exclusively will you be called Jacob, you're also in Israel. So why the change? And this is the big idea. The big idea is that within the Jew, we have both a Jacob and an Israel. There's two dimensions within the Jewish soul, the dimension of Jacob and the dimension of Israel. And therefore, today we're called by both names. And this is what we want to figure out. We want to figure out what is the definition of what is the meaning and the application of the fact that we're Jacob, and what is the definition and meaning and expression of the fact that we're Israel. And of course, we're both. When are we one? When are we the other? So this is the introduction. Now we could start warming up the engines, and you could say L'chaim and start the morning. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to share the screen. You can find actually the link on Chabad.org if you want to open it. If you have a different screen you want to open it on, that's fine. I'm just going to share it, and let's see if we can chat. There's a chat box here. There should be. You would think after 2 years of COVID, I could figure out how to use Zoom. Okay, it's in the chat box. You have to start with a joke. My favorite COVID joke was, this was a good one. So as soon as people started adapting the Zoom, so my friend tells me, he says, if your phone, the memory of your phone, if your phone does not have enough room for Zoom, for Zoom, so you could delete your Waze app and you'll make room, because you're not going to need your Waze. You're not going to need to travel. So that was in the beginning of COVID. That was funny. Every time I open my Zoom, I remember that the Zoom is instead of the Waze. Okay, but today we have Zoom and Waze, thank God. Okay, so let's begin. Here we go. So this is a talk in Yiddish, first published in Yiddish, and here you see they translate it side by side. The bold is the translation. The non-bold is sort of the introduction. Like I said, it reads, I think it flows pretty smooth. Please do not hesitate. Jump in, questions, comments, jokes. That's what we're here for. Here we go. This week's Torah reading relates how God changed Yaakov's name. Yaakov is Hebrew for Jacob, declaring, your name will no longer be Yaakov. Instead, your name will be Israel. Okay. Our sages compared this verse to the verse, your name will no longer be Avram. Instead, it will be Avraham, and state that a person who refers to Avraham by the name Avram commits a transgression. For it is written, your name will no longer be Avram. That's what the Talmud says. The Talmud says, if you call Avraham, once his name was changed by God, if you call him Avram, you're violating a commandment. The Torah says your name will no longer be Avram. So now our question is, the Talmud's question is, how come with Jacob it's different? How come when it comes to Jacob, we now refer to him not just as Israel, the new name, but also Jacob, the old name? So that's the question. So why then, ask our sages, does one not commit a transgression when he refers to Yaakov by that name rather than by the name Israel, the new name? After all, it is also written, your name will no longer be Yaakov. So what do we see here? We have two verses identical. The verse says your name will no longer be called Avram. And the Talmud says it's not just a story, it's a commandment. And therefore you're not allowed to call Avram, you're not allowed to call Avraham Avram. Yet we see with Jacob, the same the Torah says that it uses the same term. Your name will no longer be Jacob, will be Israel. And yet it's not a transgression to call him Jacob. That's the question. So what's the answer? The answer is a wonderful answer, but we'll see here it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Our sages explain that the renaming of Yaakov was different than the renaming of Avram. From the time God gave Avram his new name, the Torah refers to him by that name alone. With regard to Yaakov, by contrast, even after God gave him the name Israel, the Torah continues to refer to him as Yaakov. That's the answer. The answer is, says the Talmud, what do you mean? You look in the Torah itself refers to Jacob as Jacob, even after the name change. So if the Torah can do it, we can do it. Wonderful answer. When it comes to Avram, we find that once God says your name will no longer be Avram, it will be Avraham, the Torah never goes back to the old name. When it comes to Jacob, yeah, even after the Torah changes the name to Yisrael, we could still call him Yaakov. That's the beautiful answer of the Talmud, which is a wonderful answer. But the question is, that does not explain. That all that does is shows us how we know that the meaning of Yaakov's name change does not mean that you can't call him by the old name. How do you know? Because the Torah itself refers to him as Yaakov. So it's a good answer in the sense that how we know that it's not a transgression. But it's not sufficient because it does not fully explain, it does not explain at all why the change. Why the difference? Why when it comes to Abraham, the Torah will not refer to the old name, but when it comes to Israel, the Torah will refer to the old name. So that's our next question. What is the rationale for this distinction? Why does the Torah still refer to Yaakov by that name, even after he was given the name Israel? Now I really feel like COVID. Because my son Isaac is here instead of being in school. Here. Oh, so that's the answer. So in other words, that we have a Talmud. The Talmud asks the question. The Talmud gives a technical answer, but we want the soul. This is Hasidic teachings. We want to understand what's the soul, what's the reason. The Talmud was a technical answer. We know why. The Talmud says, well, we could see from the Torah's own conduct that the Torah never meant that you're not allowed to call Israel Jacob, because the Torah itself does so. But the question still remains, why is that? So now we have the Hasidic answer. So in Hasidus, it is explained that the names Yaakov and Yisrael reflect two different modes of divine service. Every Jew must possess both traits, for there are times when a Jew must carry out his divine service in the path reflected by the name Yaakov, and other times in which his divine service must reflect the path of Yisrael. Although Yisrael is a superior name, alluding to a loftier spiritual level, at certain times and in certain situations, the divine service of Yaakov is also necessary. So that's our answer. Our answer is the Hasidic answer. The sole answer is why are we allowed to refer to Israel as Jacob? Why does the Torah refer to Israel as Jacob? Because we have both modes within ourselves, within our divine service, and we possess both traits, both of Jacob and of Israel. And now we understand why. Well, everything is answered. We can go home because we understand why we have both names. So we're done. We're finished. Unless you want to figure out, okay, so what exactly is Jacob? What is Israel? And how does it apply? For that, you have to stick around to section number 2, to chapter number 2. Okay, so far so good. I think it's clear. Please let me know if you want to discuss anything specifically. Okay, we continue. The difference between the modes of service identified with Yaakov and Israel and Yisrael can be described as follows. How do you get to know what the difference of the spiritual mode is? Well, look at the name. Look at the origin of the name. The name Yaakov indicates that the blessings he received from Yitzchak were acquired through deception and trickery. Through cleverness, Yaakov was able to snatch Yitzchak's blessings from Esav. If you look at Rashi, If you look at Rashi, you will see, let's find the Rashi inside. Let's find the Rashi inside so we'll be able to see. You don't have to believe me. Okay, we'll open Rashi's here, show Rashi's commentary. Beautiful. It says Rashi like this. So this is, let's see the chapter, Genesis chapter 32, verse 27, 28. So let's read the verses. And he, the angel, said, let me go, for dawn is breaking. But he, Jacob, said, I will not let you go unless you have blessed me. Okay. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have commanding power with an angel of God and with men, and you have prevailed. I don't know, nice, commanding power is better than struggle. Literally, sarita, you ministered. Okay. But what the Hasidic and what the Rebbe's talk is referring to is this Rashi. Says Rashi, what does it mean your name will no longer be considered Jacob? Says Rashi, no longer will your name be Jacob. What does Jacob mean? Says Rashi, it shall no longer be said that the blessings came to you through trickery. Akva, Yaakov has two meanings. Yaakov could mean heel. He was named Yaakov because he was grasping the heel of his brother, his twin brother. But akva could also mean trickery and deceit. So when the angel says, no longer will your name be Yaakov, he means no longer will people say that the reason why you got the blessings from your father was trickery, but with nobility and openness. And then Rashi continues, ultimately God agrees. Later on, we'll see God agrees to the name. But what this is what the Rebbe is quoting. This is what the Rebbe is quoting. The Rebbe is saying, what does Yaakov mean? Yaakov means that the blessings that he gets from his father, he gets through deception and trickery, through cleverness, right? By contrast, Yisrael, Yisrael means I'm a minister. A minister doesn't need trickery. I'm the ruler. So Yisrael, by contrast, reflects a higher rung. For Yisrael, there is no need to secure blessings by craftiness. You don't need your creativity to get the blessings. Instead, they are granted to him with nobility and in a revealed manner. So you see the quotes. The quotes here are from Rashi on the verse. So that's what we know. So Yaakov is the person who has to struggle or has to use trickery to be worthy of the blessings. And Yisrael is somebody who does not need that struggle, does not need that trickery. They belong to him. The blessings are granted to him with nobility and in a revealed manner. So that is laying out the foundation. Now we have to unpack and figure out what does that really mean. Go ahead, Vicky.
I had a question. Did he need to go through trickery before he became a minister? So is that something that
Apparently yes. And we will see later that I'll give you the spoiler alert. I know I don't want anyone to jump off the call just because you know the spoiler alert, but you will see that there's different dimensions of Yisrael and Yaakov, and one of them is that the Jew during the week is like Yaakov, and the Jew on Shabbat is like Yisrael. And you have to have both dimensions, and Shabbat follows the weekday, right? The statement goes, anybody who doesn't prepare before Shabbat won't have what to eat on Shabbat. You want to eat cholent on Shabbat, you have to start it before Shabbat. Now, this does not just mean, it's not just practical advice to buy lunch for Shabbat before Shabbat, otherwise you'll go hungry. It also means spiritually, that if you want to reach the level, the holiness of Shabbat, you first have to acquire the holiness that is accessible throughout the 6 days. So that's a great observation that you don't just jump to Yisrael, you have to go through. First you reach Yaakov, then you reach Yisrael. First you reach the struggle and where you need deception and trickery. We're obviously going to talk about deception and trickery in the positive sense. We're not saying run around and trick people. It means in the positive sense, as we will discuss. And then you get to a point where you no longer need the cleverness and the trickery because everything is granted to you with quote unquote nobility and revealed manner. Okay.
Thank you. That does explain that there is some positivity in this trickery, and the other question I had from the beginning is how did they come up with this? Did they analyze every single occurrence of Yaakov and Israel in the Torah?
So if you look at Yaakov and Israel in the Torah, well, we don't have to look at every single one. You're going to see later one of them that where it's actually very easy to see it is when it comes to Bilam. Bilam in the book of Deuteronomy is the Gentile prophet who's hired to curse the Jews, and he blesses the Jews. And even in the blessings, we look at the difference between Jacob's, the way he blesses, the way he uses the word Jacob, and the way he uses the word Israel. And that's very indicative of the core of their name. But if you want to look at every instance, there are many, you could track this. There are many theories of when Yaakov is used and when Yisrael is used. Some theories would say that when you talk about Yaakov, our ancestor Jacob, when you talk about him as an individual, he's Yaakov. When you talk to him about the father of the collective Jewish people, he's Israel. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is when you look at it, when things were good in his life, he was called Yisrael. When there was challenged, he was called Yaakov. So for example, once Joseph was taken away from him, he's no longer called Yisrael. Until when? Until he senses that there's hope for him in Egypt. Because we read the story there, you see that he sensed that maybe there's a chance that Joseph is in Egypt. So at that point, you stop mentioning him Israel. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. I made a mistake. I wasn't precise. I think that, let me look. Why do I have to speak by heart if I could look?
Well, thank you very much. But my question was mostly like, how did they come up with it? Because we do consistently see those differences.
The different names, right? But the answer is, so the answer is that there are a few ways to do it. There are ways to do it. What the Rebbe started with is, let's go back to the origin. The first time Israel was mentioned, let's see what Rashi says, right? And that's what Rashi says. Yaakov means struggle. Yaakov means that you have to use trickery, and Israel means you don't. But I already mentioned it, so I want to see if I can find it. Maybe I could, maybe I can't. We'll see. Otherwise, we'll just continue. We'll move on. Okay, yeah, I don't see the verse that I was still referring to. I'm pretty sure that as long as Joseph was away, he's not Yisrael. He's Yaakov. Once Joseph comes back, or he knows Joseph is fine, then he's Yisrael. So you see that you could read this in many dimensions, even in his physical life. Challenging times are Jacob, happy times are Israel. Collectively, so the same thing here is struggle is Jacob. Nobility, struggle as in struggle that requires deception and trickery is Jacob. However, is Yisrael, being the minister, means when things are no longer, do not require the struggle. Okay. Now we go to another principle. The actions of the patriarchs are a sign for their descendants. This is a quote from the Medrash, but we say this many times. Nachmanides always uses this phrase to explain the entire book of Genesis. He says, look, everything that happens to the patriarchs is really a sign for the children. So if our ancestor Jacob had both those dimensions of Yaakov, Jacob, and Yisrael, Israel, that's because we too in our life, we have the same thing. So the actions of our patriarchs providing Jews in every generation with guidance in their divine service. Many of the defining spiritual characteristics of Yaakov's mode of service are reflected in the story of his receiving the blessings his father intended for Esav. In other words, this is not just a technicality. Did you get the blessings through trickery, or are you deserving of them in the open? But really, this is a reflection of two states of being within Jacob, and that is also reflected within our own divine service. So let's continue unpacking. The meaning of a verse never departs from the straightforward interpretation. That's another principle. Rashi quotes this. You always have to, no matter how much you want to interpret in a spiritual way and a mystical way, you also have to keep your eye on the simple interpretation of the verse. So if you want to get insight into the Kabbalistic meaning, you have to also remain loyal to the simple meaning. Thus, the blessings given by Yitzchak to Yaakov, the dew of the heavens and the fat of the earth, refer to material prosperity. To receive these blessings, Yaakov and Rebekah, were willing to take life-threatening risks and employ various forms of deception. For example, Yaakov had to wear the clothes that Esav had taken from Nimrod, even though Nimrod had caused the entire world to rebel against God with his kingship. What was the purpose of these tactics? To extract the sparks of godliness contained in these material entities and elevate them to holiness. What is happening here? So, when Rebekah comes to Jacob and says, look, we need to we need to get the blessings from your father. So the verse says she took the precious clothing that belonged to Esav. Doesn't tell us, it's very cryptic. It doesn't tell us exactly, doesn't tell us what type of clothing these were, but there's something about the clothing that she says, you have to wear clothing. You have to wear these clothing. And it's not that the clothing, separate from the clothing we know, she also put goat skin on his hands and on his neck to stimulate Esav's hairy, to copy Esav's hairy skin. But separate from that, it says that she takes Esav's precious clothing. So let's see what the clothing represents. Let's see if Rashi says it. I'm just taking a peek. Not sure he does. It could be it's the Medrash. We'll take a peek here quickly. Oh, Rashi says it. Look at that. Everything here is from Rashi. Oh, so I'll just so let's read Rashi. Let's read the verse in Rashi. Isaac, check it. Okay. So and Rebecca took the costly garments. The word in Hebrew is chamudot. Chamud in modern Hebrew is cute, but really chamud, the etymology of the word is the desirable. So they translate desirable as costly, I guess, because that's how you define cost. The more people want it, the more desirable it is. So Rebecca took the desirable garments of Esav, her elder son, which were with her in the house, and she dressed Jacob, her younger son. And that's 15. And then in verse 16, and the hides of the kids she put on his hands and on the smoothness of his neck. So if his father taps him, his father will see that he's hairy. Says Rashi, what does it mean? What kind of garments? What does it mean she took the costly garments, or the valuable garments, the desirable garments? Says Rashi, the costly hachamudot means the clean ones. As the Targum renders, dachyata, clean ones. So the Targum translates, she put on a nice suit, a clean suit, straight out of the dry cleaners. You get the dry cleaners, you know it's in the plastic. He takes off the plastic and puts it on her son. That's the first interpretation. Davar acher, another explanation, and this is the Midrashic explanation, and this is the one that I was going to quote. The one's garments that he had coveted, shechamad from Nimrod. So it says that this is garments that were desirable. Who desired them? Esav desired them. Why? Who did Esav desire them from? Nimrod. Who's Nimrod? Nimrod is the character that's earlier in the Torah who becomes the first leader of an empire. He's the king. Apparently, he has a nice suit. Esav wants it. Esav gets a hold of it. According to the Medrash, I believe Esav also killed Nimrod to get those garments, but that's another story. What's relevant for us is that Jacob's mother says, you want the blessing, you want the fat of the earth and the dew of the heaven, which is the blessing that the father was going to give his son. So you therefore need to put on the garments of Nimrod. Who's Nimrod? Nimrod, the Hebrew word Nimrod means rebel. So Nimrod has caused the entire world to rebel against God with his kingship. That's what the Medrash says. That's why he's called Nimrod. Nevertheless, if you want to be successful in the physical world, you have to adapt the garments of Nimrod. You have to invest yourself in the physical world just as Nimrod does. What's the purpose? The purpose is to extract the sparks. What are we saying here? We're saying that naturally, Jacob doesn't want the blessings from his father. What do I mean doesn't want the blessings? I don't want to get into the whole thing that the blessings that Jacob intended to give to Esav were very physical blessings. Fat of the earth, dew of the heaven, much grain and wine. Many nations will serve you, etc., etc. These are physical blessings. Jacob himself, Yaakov himself doesn't care for physical blessings. He'd rather sit in the tent and study Torah. But his mother says it doesn't work that way. His mother says, look, you need to be successful in the physical world as well. To do so, you have to do something that's uncomfortable for you. You have to use trickery. And you also have to use the garments of Nimrod, who was a terrible person. In other words, Nimrod was the person who caused people to rebel against God. And you have to do that because you have to extract the sparks of holiness that are in the physical reality. So this is the big idea. This is the foundation. And now we're going to elaborate what that means. That's Jacob. Jacob is this trickery. So to be successful in the physical world, you have to use a certain degree of trickery. And this will be explained, hopefully. will be explained. What does it mean, trickery, in the positive sense? When I say trickery, everybody gets offended and says it's so terrible. Trickery is always bad. But let's see if we can redefine what trickery means. So here we go. We'll read another piece, and then let me just get a thing how long this is going to take us. I think that soon we're going to get to Yisrael. Yeah, we have to leave at least one. We have to read at least another chapter. Okay, and then we could that will be a full idea, and then we'll see if we want to continue, or if not, we continue next year. Okay, what is, if you had to define trickery? Let's close it. Let's make a little skit, a little test. If you had to define trickery, what's the definition of trickery? So why is trickery considered? If you want to jump in, how would you define trickery? And why is trickery so bad? So trickery is so bad is because you're taking advantage of somebody else. That's really, you trick somebody else. When we think of trickery, that's the element of trickery that we think of. But if you want to just look at the characteristics of trickery on its own, without and strip it of the negativity, what would you end up with? So the definition of trickery from the perspective of the Hasidic interpretation is trickery means that you're not, how do I say this? You're not transparent, in the sense that your intention, what you express on the surface, is not your deeper intention. That's the definition of trickery, where you have, in Hebrew there's a phrase, there's one thing in your mouth and one thing in your heart. Now, it's negative if you're using it to trick other people. But if you extract that negativity and say, what does trickery mean? Trickery means I have a hidden agenda. It could be a good one, it could be a bad one, it could be to take advantage of somebody else, it could be to make the world a better place. It doesn't really matter. In other words, it doesn't have to be negative from the perspective of the Kabbalistic interpretation. The definition of trickery, for the purpose of our discussion, is that you have a hidden agenda that is not clear on the surface. Now that we have a definition, we could start unpacking or elaborating. So says the Rebbe like this: this serves as a lesson for us in our divine service. A Jew must approach eating, drinking, and other material activities with a certain measure of craft and deception. How does a person perpetuate a fraud? He does not reveal his true intent. He begins by appearing to follow the path which his opponent desires, but at a crucial point, he changes course and does what he desires, although it is against the other's wishes, right? If I want to fraud you, what do? I come and I make believe I'm your friend. I make believe I do good for you. Maybe in the beginning, I actually do good for you. I say, come give me money, you'll invest it with me and I'll give you a dividend. The beginning, the first 2 months, I give you a dividend. Then all of a sudden I run away with the cash, right? So in the beginning, you appear to be like your friend, and then you come up with your own agenda. Says the Rebbe, this is the way a Jew should approach material activities. On the surface, he is involved in material activities like everyone else. He eats, drinks, and deals in commerce and the like. However, he engages in these activities for the sake of heaven, not for any material purpose at all. He wears Esav's clothes, but carries out all his material activities with a sense of inner purpose, to extract the sparks of godliness contained in these material entities and to elevate them to holiness. What does this mean, and why is this positive? So two people are going to business. They appear on the surface that they're doing the same thing. One person wants success. He wants a bonus at the end of the year. That's what he wants. He wants a paycheck, he wants a salary, he wants a bonus, and he wants what the money could buy: peace, security, pleasure, etc. Then on the same train, there's somebody riding right next to him to the city. And that person appears to be exactly the same. Quote unquote, he's wearing the same garments. Okay? He wants the same measure of success. He wants everything the same. But this guy's a fraud in the positive sense. What does it mean that he's a fraud? What does it mean that he's a fraud? It means he doesn't really want what it appears he wants, right? It's confusing. He has a hidden agenda. It looks like what he wants is material success or material pleasure, but that's not what he wants. What he's doing, what he really wants is he wants the holiness within the physical. He wants to be able to have the physical possessions, not for his own personal agenda, but to be able to elevate the sparks, to use the materialism for the purpose for which it was created. That is trickery in the positive sense. That's the element of Jacob. So in other words, when a Jew pursues material success, that is the definition of Jacob. Why? Because you have to pursue material success, and you can only be successful if you invest yourself in it, and you put on those garments and you try to be successful. But nevertheless, I hate to be the one to break it to you, nevertheless, you're a fraud. Because what does it mean you're a fraud? You have a hidden agenda. I don't really want the cash for the sake of the cash. I have a hidden agenda. What's my hidden agenda? The spiritual sparks that are within the cash. Then you get to this level of Israel, where Israel is when a person has other pursuits, he's not into the pursuit of the physical. So let's continue. Let's see if we can finish this chapter. The divine service of Israel is quite different. The blessings for material prosperity granted him are conferred upon him with nobility and in revealed manner. He does not have to conceal the godly intent of his material involvements, for material concerns do not create a conflict for him. For him, there is no concealment of their godly source. To cite an example, by simply eating his Shabbat meal, a Jew is performing a mitzvah. This is different from the task of refinement which he performs during the week. During the week, a Jew practices deception. Every time he performs a physical activity for a spiritual purpose, he eats, but it is with deception, because he is eating for the sake of heaven, to elevate the food to its source and holiness. On Shabbat, by contrast, the physical activity of eating itself reflects holiness. So this is very interesting. Okay, we still have what to do. Okay. This is very interesting. What the Rebbe is doing over here is saying there's two types of activities that a person could engage in. And we're going to look at the same type of activity, and we'll see how the same activity, eating, could be Jacob, could be Israel. Jacob would be, I'm eating breakfast on the weekday. So what does that mean? It means that I'm engaged in something physical, but it's deception in the sense that I have a spiritual purpose. Why am I eating breakfast? Not only because it tastes good and I need the nutrition so I can go to work, but also because it's a spiritual exercise, because when I eat for a purpose, for a holy purpose, I can extract the holy sparks that are in the physical, and I can elevate them back to spirituality. So that's a certain degree of deception. There's two layers. There's the outer layer, which is this is a physical activity. And then there's the inner layer where there is a spiritual purpose to this physical activity. That's the state of mind of Jacob. That's the Jacob Jew. But then there is an Israel Jew. In other words, sometimes there's no deception. There's no outer layer and inner layer. Why not? Because the outer layer itself is a spiritual experience. And what's the example? The example is when a Jew eats on Shabbat. When you eat on Shabbat, the meal itself is a mitzvah. When you eat in the weekday, eating a tuna sandwich is not a mitzvah. It's a physical activity, but there can be a spiritual purpose to this physical activity. But there's an outer layer and an inner layer. But then there's certain activities, and later we're going to apply this to the state of the soul. But so far we're dealing with the activities. We're only on rung number one. There are certain activities that are physical, but they're here for a spiritual purpose. That's Jacob. And then there are activities that are not, even though they're performed in the physical world with physical phenomenon, they're not a physical activity. It's a spiritual activity to begin with. There's no layers. As soon at the outset, you see that it's a spiritual concept. What is that? Eating on Shabbat. Eating on Shabbat is a mitzvah. It's not physical for the sake of spiritual. It's a spiritual experience to begin with. That's the Jacob. That's the Israel. That's level one. That's in my action. Later, we'll see the state of my soul, the state of my mind. Well, if we get there, let's see. But first, we want to continue and we want to finish the paragraph. This concept is alluded to by Yaakov being given the name Yisrael, which has granted to him because you have shown mastery with angels. Sarita, you became the minister, you mastered over angels and men and prevailed. Angels and men both refer to challenges involving the concealment of godly influence. Angels refer to the 70 spiritual archangels who serve as the channels through which the divine influence that maintains material existence passes. Through this process of spiritual descent, godliness becomes veiled. Okay. What are we saying? You became a master over God. What does it mean you master over God? You can't become a master over God. How can you become master over God? So in this context, Elohim is angels. What does it mean you mastered over the angels? So what the Rebbe is saying over here is angels represent, what is an angel? What is an angel? An angel is a spiritual energy. But for the purpose of our discussion, the angels are the conduits through which the divine energy descends and becomes physical influence in this world. In other words, God does not give nature. In other words, the laws of nature don't come directly from God. They come through the system of what they would call the order of the evolution of the worlds. Part of that system is that there are angels, and each angel represents the source of a physical phenomena, and the flow from God comes through the angels. Now, when it goes through, why does God create it that way? Because when the influence goes through the angels, it's concealed and it's veiled. Then you don't see that it's a miracle. It looks like it came through nature. The veiling of godliness brought about by these angels leads to a greater degree of concealment. The challenge is brought about by men, coarse individuals who ridicule Jews for observing the Torah and the mitzvot. As is painfully obvious, it is more difficult to overcome obstacles placed in one's paths by humans than those which are brought about by spiritual beings, i.e., the inherent veiling of godliness involved in the creation of material existence. For this reason, the first section of the entire four-part Shulchan Aruch begins by stating, "Do not be embarrassed by those who scoff. This is the foundation of our entire divine service, to break through the forces that conceal godliness." Okay, so what happens here? What we're saying is like this. Jacob is the one who struggles. Who does Jacob struggle with? There's two elements. There's men and there's God. So men is the physical people, people that the challenges that come from people who scoff. And the Rebbe says that's a very difficult challenge. And therefore you open up the code of law. The first thing the code of law says, do not, a person should not be ashamed and embarrassed by the people who scoff. That's the challenge posed by people. But then what we're also saying here, there's a challenge posed by God. What is God? God in this context is Elohim, is the angels. The name Elohim could mean angels. This is the idea that it appears that the flow of energy from God goes through the angels, and therefore it appears that it's natural, and therefore you don't necessarily see that this is holy. It looks natural. And what's the Jew's job? The job of the Jew is to say, despite the fact that I'm engaged in something that appears physical and natural, I see the spirituality here. I'm going to use it for spirituality. In the metaphor we used earlier, I'm eating breakfast. So this is something physical and something not a mitzvah, but I'm using it for a holy purpose. I'm finding holiness within this physical experience. Okay, so that's a degree of deception, and that's a degree of struggle. The advantage alluded to by the name Yisrael, the ability to show mastery with angels and men and prevail, is that Yisrael has dominion and control over the concealment perpetuated by both angels and men. These forces do not cause any concealment whatsoever for Israel. Not only do they not contend with him, they consent to the blessings that he receives. Yisrael does more than defeat the archangel of Esav. He compels the angel to bless him. In keeping with the dictum, even his enemies will establish peace with him. This motive also includes the greatest enemy, the primordial serpent, the source of all sin and conflict. Not only will this force not present any opposition to Israel, it will establish peace with him and even provide him with assistance. So what are we really saying here? We're saying here a few things, and this is really the end of this paragraph, leads to the next paragraph, the next section. But I'll try to sum this up and see if this is a full concept and see if we could stop here. What is Jacob? Jacob is the person who struggles. Why does he struggle? He struggles because there's two primary reasons for the struggle. Number one is the struggle because to live your values in a society that does not necessarily believe or respect those values, there's challenges from people. Okay, but there's also a deeper challenge. There's also a challenge from quote unquote God, the angels, meaning to say, the way God creates the world, God conceals himself, he veils himself. The flow comes down through the angels, creates natural phenomenon, and there's physical existence in this world that's physical and seems to be in opposition to spirituality and holiness. And what's the Jew's job? The Jew's job is to struggle and ultimately overcome and show I'm going to engage in physical activity, but the purpose of the physical activity is for a spiritual purpose. So what am I doing? I'm extracting the sparks of holiness in the physical. But that's a struggle. There's no question that's a struggle. Okay. What is Israel? Israel means I'm the minister over the struggle. Minister means I'm the minister over both people and God. But minister means there's no struggle to begin with. When I am in the state of mind of Israel, I don't see any concealment to begin with. So the physical is not a distraction to begin with. What's the metaphor we used for this? We used for this is the metaphor of eating food on Shabbat, where it's not a physical phenomenon that has to be used for a spiritual purpose, but it's a mitzvah to begin with. It's a holy purpose to begin with. And I'm going to try maybe do another paragraph or two, not a full section, but I'm going to try to select a paragraph. What we're going to say is that the same thing applies to within the soul. Take a question in a minute, Vicky. Within the soul, that within the soul, there's part of me that's tempted by negativity. And the job of that part of myself is to battle with the negativity. But then there's part of me that is not even tempted by the negativity. I'm Israel. I'm a minister over the struggle, meaning there is no struggle. The struggle does not, it's not tempting. The negativity is not tempting. That is Yisrael. Now, there's dimension within myself, which doesn't have to battle the evil because I'm a minister over the evil. That's part of me. Then there's the part of me that is tempted by evil. And that is struggle. And that has to, when that part of me engages in the physical world, it's a struggle, it's a battle, and there's a certain level of deception. Deception means part of me is drawn to the physical, but then I have to say, but I have a hidden agenda, and I'm going to use the physical for the spiritual. But then there's somewhere else which is not even drawn to the physical to begin with. And we'll see later that some is on Shabbat. It's much easier to connect to the Israel part of myself. On Shabbat, it's much easier to connect to the part of my soul where the negativity is not tempting to begin with. And that's the Israel level, as opposed to the Jacob level is usually the state of mind that the Jew is during the week, where there is struggle, there is negativity, and I have to engage with the physical world to extract the holiness within the physical world, but it's still a struggle. I overcome the struggle, but it's a struggle. I get the blessings, but the blessings come through some measure of conflict. And again, why do I have both? Because both are necessary. Both are two dimensions within the soul. Both are necessary for bringing the world to perfection. So unfortunately, we have to stop here. There's a lot more to say. I'm going to stick around for another 2-3 minutes for questions and comments. But what's the takeaway? If we have to take away the point is that part of us, right? Sometimes we look at ourselves and we see the struggle and we define ourselves by the struggle. If I'm tempted by evil, obviously I'm a person who has to struggle with evil and I'm defined by the evil. So we say, no, the part of me that struggles with evil is only part of me. That's not my essence. That's not my full personality. I have both the Jacob and Israel. And even after I become Israel, I still have my Jacob. In other words, there is still a purpose in engaging in the physical world and struggling with the physical world, because that's exactly what God wants, where the physical world should be a concealment, and then I have to battle the concealment. Why is the battle so important? That you have to come back another time. It's explained in many places in the Hasidic writings, especially in the Tanya, which we may actually start Tanya on Friday. We'll see. We'll talk about that. But in any case, this is just a lot more to say. This is just getting our feet wet. But that's the story in short, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining. Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that's kind of an answer to my earlier question. If because we are children of Israel, is it a natural progression that we have to go through the struggle first, and there is some good in going through the struggle, because that's how you achieve the level of Israel and
right,
overcome.
Right. It's almost impossible to. It is possible, but sometimes you can't expect to get to the point where the evil is not tempting. To start with that, you start with the point where the evil is tempting, and when you overcome your temptation, let me give you an example. When I'm a kid, or even I'm still a kid, you come home and the cotton candy is tempting, right? Let's say you have cotton candy, physical thing. Initially, the cotton candy is being tempting. If you exert self-control and you get to the point where you don't, where you overcome this battle, where you say, you know something, I'm going to develop a taste of broccoli, and broccoli will be something that I enjoy. Over time, you can get to the point where the cotton candy is not tempting, but you can't expect to have that right away.
And also what I meant was external evil, the one that sends through the angels, that also you have to overcome. So there is some good in that too, in struggle.
Yes,
because
and especially what we're going to say with the Shabbat weekday, you're going to go back. And I was going to say this also before, just because you reach Israel, you're going to go back to the point where evil is tempting, because spiritually speaking, there's the holiness of the weekday and the holiness of Shabbat. and the weekday is nature. And it's much harder to see to sense the real truth of the universe during Shabbat, during the weekday. During the weekday, the world and the concealment is felt in a stronger way. So it's harder to reach the point where I say the physicality on itself is not meaningful to me. I just want the spirituality. In the weekday, it's the part of me that senses deception in the way we define it. I do want material success. Hopefully, I also want it for a spiritual purpose, but it itself is tempting to me. And that's part of what you need to do, because if I'm a person with a physical, where the physical blessing and the physical materialism is not meaningful, I'm not really extracting the sparks from that perspective, right? Extracting the sparks means I'm in the concealment and I find the holiness within the concealment. But if I'm a person where the concealment is not concealing, then you're not in that psychological space, then you're not extracting the sparks from that psychological space. In other words, the idea is to transform the concealment. So there has to be a concealment to be able to transform. And then you reach to the point where you advance. You came to Israel and no longer is there a concealment, but that's temporary. Then you go back. During the weekday, you go back. So Shabbat, you get to the point where nothing matters, only spirituality matters. But on Sunday morning, the physicality matters again, not only because the bills are coming in the mail. That's just the practical point, that on Shabbat, I block everything out. But then the weekday, it comes back and I have to deal with it. But it's also spiritually speaking. There's a separate service of Shabbat. Separate service of Shabbat is to tune into the part of self where what only matters is spirituality. But then, but in the weekday, that's not my goal. My goal is to be invested in the world on its terms and find the holy sparks within the world. So for that, the world has to matter. For that, the world has to conceal. And then I deal with the concealment. And then I have a certain degree of deception where it's multidimensional. On one level, I really want the physical success. On another level, I want it because I have a hidden agenda, which is to use it for holiness, to use the sparks for holiness. So it's much more complex during the week. Shabbat is simple. I don't need nothing other than God. But you can't stay in that space for too long because we're living in the physical world. So I move between my Jacob and my Israel. And that's why, even though the Torah says your name will no longer be Jacob, it doesn't mean your name will no longer be Jacob. How do I know? Because the Torah itself refers to him as Jacob. But why? Why? Because the purpose of creation is to have both Jacob and Israel. And that is reflected in the two parts of my soul. The part of my soul where materialism is not meaningful, it's not tempting, it's not what I want. I just want to fuse with God. And that is the Israel part of my soul. More easily accessible as Shabbat. Or we'll see later, I think the Rebbe says it, that this every day, the times that you pray or study, that's the Shabbat of that day. Right? Wednesday morning, if you're going to say Shema, that moment is your Shabbat. That moment is a moment of spiritual retreat, where in that moment, physicality doesn't matter. But then you go back to Jacob and there's a struggle, and you have to overcome the struggle, but it's a struggle.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's part of our spiritual growth with your help, with every class.
We're all in it together. We're all in the same boat. We all have Jacob, we have Israel, we have struggle, we have overcoming the struggle. Go ahead,
Rabbi, question for you. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Elisa.
Elisa.
I think it's sort of tangential. The part where you said, "Do not be embarrassed by those who scoff." That's from. Where did you say it was from?
So it comes from the opening statement of the Shulchan Aruch, which is based on the ethics of the fathers, which says, "Yehuda ben Tema Omer, Hevi Askan Amer." When you serve God, you should be bold as a leopard. It also says fast as it gets created. It gets Hevi Askan Amer. You should run like a deer. You should be strong like a lion to do the will of your Father in heaven. So that's the Mishnah, Tractate 5 of Avot of the Ethics of the Fathers. But the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Law, says, what does it mean to be bold like a leopard? Be bold like a leopard means not to be ashamed. Stand up for what you believe in, and don't give in to peer pressure, which takes a certain boldness. And what the Rebbe is saying is, the author of the Code of Law incorporates this as the first principle before anything else. The number one, the foundational principle is don't be ashamed in the face of the scoffers, because if you do, then you're not going to keep the rest of the book either, right? So in that sense, it's foundational.
So that's why it's throughout our prayers then.
What is throughout our prayers?
There are different parts throughout the prayers where it's saying, and I guess through Psalms that, you're not supposed to be ashamed.
Yeah,
to
in
be embarrassed.
Psalms, it's all over Psalms, right? Because David has to deal with the fact that he's an outsider and he's being oppressed, and he has to have his internal conviction to believe that the path is the path of the righteous is the right path, because the path of the righteous is not the popular path, at least not yet.
Thank you.
Rabbi, in Bilam's prophecy, when it says Matovu ha'olecho Yaakov Mishkanotecha Yisrael, what's the difference between Jacob and Israel and that?
So
phrase?
we don't have time to get into that. Ohel is temporary, and Mishkan is permanent. So Jacob's connection to holiness is temporary. Israel's is permanence. He also, later on in the thing, he says, Lo hibit aven b'Yaakov, lo ra'a amal b'Yisrael, a very beautiful verse. God sees no iniquity in Jacob, but he sees no toil in Israel. So what we're going to say, what the Rebbe says further in the essay, and I sent a link here so you can find it in the chat, is that when it comes to Jacob, there's no iniquity, there's no idol worship, but there is toil, because there is struggle. When it comes to Israel, it says he sees no struggle, he sees he sees no struggle in Israel, because Israel is a state of mind where there's no struggle, because the physical material world is no longer tempting. The negativity is no longer tempting. So that's state of mind of Israel. Jacob, however, there's no oven, which could be either a sin or iniquity. It's iniquity, but in that context, it means there's no idol worship. But don't say there's no struggle. There is a struggle. We overcome the struggle, but it's still a struggle. Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody. Pleasure spending time, and we should see each other in good health.
Yashikok, Rabbi.
Thank you.
So
Be well.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.